It's very nice to see you here with us.
Thank you for inviting me. Nice to see you.
You're welcome. Today, we will mainly talk about the US foreign policy of the Biden administration. But before proceeding with that, I want to ask you about the extraordinary transition process that the USA has been going through. The way the Trump administration ended was unprecedented in the history of the USA. What are your opinions about this transition? Why has it happened in such a way?
Well, it's a long history. A lot of people trying to explain the whole thing in terms of problems that Trump administration created from the beginning, and they are treating it as if the problems of the United States started with Trump. But this is not the case. For many, many decades, especially since after World War II, actually, and then after the 9/11, the U.S. imperialism's policy of militarization and neoliberalism that has been going on for years, started actually with Ronald Reagan, has created such a division, class division in society and racial division in society that has been brewing under the surface for all this time. Now, what Trump administration did actually was brought all these contradictions to the surface for the society, and the clashes became open. That was the effect of Trump administration. But Trump did not create those problems. Trump was a kind of a manifestation of the existence of those problems. Now, the Trump administration, by its actions, made another issue very clear, and that was the issue of the legitimacy of the state's institutions and the state in the United States. A lot of people had lost trust in the US government for a long time. But the way Trump acted, it made it very visible that the institutions of the state are not able to manage the society in a way that can continue. And this clash led to massive protests. Of course, another element, which was the coronavirus pandemic, also exacerbated the situation for the people. And on the one hand, the frustration with lack of ability of the state to manage and deal with corona pandemic. On the other hand, with the built up racial tensions that existed all over the time for decades, and the economic problems and the increasing poverty, healthcare problems, unemployment, other issues that have been really inflicting society for a long time, they all came together during that phase. And if you look at it, for example, the question of police brutality, this is something that has been going on for years in the United States, for decades, against the blacks and people of color. But shootings 10 years ago by the police did not bring a million people into the streets. Mm-hmm. But this time it did, because really all of the contradictions were coming to the surface at once. And this polarization actually had given rise to some kind of a right-wing populism that Trump represented, in fact. And Trump became the organizer of the right wing, actually. Again, from the Reagan era and afterwards, these cells of right-wing militias and anti-state militias were forming. But with the Trump administration, with the Trump becoming the spokesperson for them, they took a national character and gradually became organized in a national kind of format. They came together. And the interesting part is that with the defeat of Trump and the claims of the loss of, stealing of the elections and all that, and his loss of the elections, and now his trial at the Senate and all that, has created a kind of what in the Middle East call a martyr, the first martyr for the right wing, in fact. And now they are organizing around this. The objective is not necessarily Trump. Trump is just a banner. But it is the polar opposition within society, that there's no middle ground left anymore, is causing this. And the tensions are high. And if you look at it, despite all the problems that Trump administration had, at the end, in 2020, the elections, he had 10 million more votes than the first time. And the society is more or less evenly split between the extreme right wing and the left. And the two parties who try to keep a center posture for a long time and work with each other from the center are unable to manage this deep contradiction. And that is why the crisis is all over the place, not only within the society, but within the state institutions right now as well. And we think that we are entering a new qualitative stage in the internal affairs of the United States, that the business as usual as before will not be possible anymore. We expect a lot of violence to go on at the level of society, again, at the level of confrontations at upper levels between parties, lack of cooperation because there's no common ground to cooperate on. And all this is causing a lot of tension, and what you're witnessing today is just a manifestation of the contradictions of US imperialism coming to its head internally today.
Yeah. So many people seem to be happy that Trump has left the presidency. On the other hand, we see that the new Biden administration has started out with signs of a rather aggressive foreign policy. The prominent cadres of this new administration are figures that will carry out such a policy, at least it seems so. The Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, for example, is one of them. He's saying something new every day, giving hints about their approaches. What do you think about this? How will the US foreign policy be shaped in the near future?
It's a question that takes hours and hours to answer, but
yes, we have only just a few minutes.
First of all, I want to clarify some misinterpretation. And it is usually one of the flaws of the movement here in the United States. People think generally that it is the political parties that decide on the foreign policy of the United States, and sometimes most of it internally as well. This is a mistake. It's a misconception. It is not the political parties that decide on the policy of the United States, especially its foreign policy. It is the military-industrial complex, the financial institutions, the Wall Street. These are the ones that set the foreign policy of the United States. It's the interests and needs of capital, global capital, that determines what the United States does internationally, and has nothing to do with who is in power, which party is in power in the United States. If you look at from the World War II onwards, if you look at it, the foreign policy of the United States, despite switches back and forth between Republicans and Democrats, has never changed. And as a result, we are witnessing the same policy. And we should not expect a different policy just because Biden or Democrats have won. There is one significant or important difference between Democrats and Republicans, I would say. Well, I don't mean the party-wise, but the whole segment of the ruling class of the country that supports the Democratic Party and the segment that supports the Republican Party. There's a big difference between the two of them in terms of method, not in terms of objective or policy. The Democratic Party types are more far-sighted than Republicans. They try to kind of cover or sugarcoat their policies with so-called democratic or humanitarian policies, not blunt aggression. If you look at the history, this has been the policy. Look at Obama versus Bush, for example, right? So this is one feature that is different. Secondly, there's a difference in terms of how they approach the foreign policy. The Republicans, as Trump really signified it in his policy, America first policy, which was not just Trump. George Bush unilaterally attacked Iraq by pissing off French and Germans and others, right? It's their own allies. So America first is the policy of Republicans, generally. That's their approach to it. On the other hand, the Democratic Party is a NATO first party. They want to do it in a united way with all of their imperialist allies around the world. And that is a big difference. And if you look at the policies that Trump advanced, for example, the withdrawal from the nuclear deal, the attacks on Venezuela in a blunt way, although it was the Obama administration who started it, but did it softly, right? The Trump was the one that had his own appointed president and alternative president and all those things. And this was at the expense of Europeans. They didn't agree with it. So that caused a division within the imperialist camp. The Democrats in the opposite direction. And if you look at the wars that happened since 9/11, right? Iraq was unilateral. Expansion of sanctions on Cuba and Venezuela was unilateral. But if you look at the war in Libya, in Afghanistan, on Syria, all of them are NATO oriented.
Right.
When the Democrats are in power, you see NATO at work. When you see the Republicans, it's US alone. I'm jumping ahead, but there's a problem here, which is a requirement of international capital. US, with the rise of power of China and conflict with Russia in the global scene, US cannot afford anymore to go single-handedly. It has to create an international camp, imperialist camp against the rising power of China. And that is the overriding principle right now with the Biden administration. And that's why you see all of those changes in the policy in terms of reorienting foreign policy towards this globalization again.
Yeah, what you're talking about is very clear, especially about the attitude towards Russia. They're trying to push Germany and the other European powers to their policy, especially using the Navalny affair. Germany was at the forefront. So we started talking about Russia and China, and the policy of the Trump administration against China was the only thing maybe praised by the Democrats now. What can we expect? How far can this aggressive attitude towards these two countries go?
Well, it depends on a lot of factors. I basically think it's going to intensify. Of course, it will not become full-fledged until the US achieves its united front with Europeans all over again. So there must be a kind of regaining of the trust between the two sides. But when that camp is really organized, it is my feeling that then the major assault on China and Russia will begin. And there's a problem also. The question of the countries that are resisting US domination and imperialist domination. There are 39 countries under attack economically or militarily, right? These countries are becoming potential allies for China and Russia in this struggle, global competition, global conflict, rivalry. So you are talking about not only intensification of the attack or pressure on China and Russia. And the beginning of it, it has already started. We're dealing with the new Cold War era.
Mhm.
And my feeling is that's going to intensify. And Biden has already, as a first step, has moved in the direction of really announcing its opposition to, or his plans for China and Russia, has already established that.
Yeah.
But if you look at it, it is also establishing other forms of regional policies similar to this, which is all based on the project for the new American century that actually the Bush administration adopted as a foreign policy of the United States, which has two parameters. One, after the collapse of Soviet Union, actually dismantling of the USSR and collapse of international socialist camp, right? No, US is not supposed to allow another powerful rival to arrive on the scene. They want to remain the only superpower. That's one. Secondly, this new American century that is supposed to be dominated by the United States, right?
Mhm.
The plan is to crush any country in any region that resists US domination. Okay? So that was from the George Bush time, which was the policy, either through regime change, partition of the country, or bringing the governments to their knees to accept the US domination. And they have been advancing this. Now, before, they didn't have this additional element of the rise of China to this supreme power. Now they're afraid that any of these resisting countries in all regions could become allies of China and Russia within this international rivalry that is going to develop between the two camps. So they're going to intensify not only the Cold War against China and Russia, but also will intensify the attacks, economic and military, against those other 39 countries and try to kind of crush them and bring them back to the imperialist camp rather than being allies of the resistance.
Mhm.
That's the process, in my view. And it's going to get worse.
I agree that it's going to get worse. So, coming from that point, we may talk about the situation in the Middle East, because one of the 39 countries you have been talking about is Iran. And of course, one of the first things that the State Department declared that was that they're going to support Israel, that the policy towards Israel will not change, that ensuring Israel's security will be primary goal. And Blinken just yesterday said that the Golan Heights belong to Israel. There's no doubt about that, according to their view.
Mm-hmm.
So, how about the nuclear deal with Iran? Can Biden go back to the deal, or will he prefer to continue the aggression against Iran?
Well, let us look at it from the Middle East policy first, and then go to Iran and Israel. There are three elements or three sides to the US policy based on the picture that I drew before. I'm going to go over these three dimensions. One, the objective is breaking down the Iran-Syria Hezbollah resistance front with the help, which is going on with the help of Russia and partly China. Second is to eliminate the power of resistance of Iran and Syria through a regime change. And third, to maintain and strengthen the military power of the State of Israel and guarantee its exclusive supremacy in military and nuclear power. This is the general policy. Now, we all know that the whole question of conflict with Iran is not a nuclear problem, nor is it just a political problem. With Iran, there's a deep-rooted problem of the revolution of 1979 that removed Iran from the camp of imperialism, from CENTO, brought it into non-aligned movement, and also gave it an independent policy, especially independent foreign policy, which is acting independently in the region right now. So the problem of United States imperialism with Iran is not just nuclear, it's just an excuse for it. If you look at the Obama administration's deal, the people think that, well, the whole nuclear deal was going hunky-dory and everything was good until Trump came. It is not true. United States did not live by any of its commitments during Obama administration. It even extended the economic war by 10 years against Iran. Obama's administration did that. They never lifted the sanctions they promised to lift. None of that happened. So it was not all okay until Trump came, first of all. It was defunct to begin with. Now Trump comes and removes it altogether, right? What were the reasons they moved out of the deal, the US? It wasn't that Iran was in violation, right?
Yeah.
It was that they wanted more. They wanted that nuclear deal was a cover for stopping the regional policy of Iran. Its support for Syria, its support for Hezbollah, it's siding with Russia in many ways. In Iraq, having an independent role. In Afghanistan, playing an independent role, right? All of them blocking US plans. If you look at the 12-point reasons that Pompeo listed for returning to the nuclear deal,
Yeah.
I read some of them. Out of the 12, I read some of them for you, right? Iran must end its proliferation of ballistic missiles and halt further launching or development of nuclear-capable missile systems. So it's not nuclear anymore. It's Iran missile system. Iran must end support to Middle East terrorist group, including Lebanese Hezbollah, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So forget the support for Palestine, right? Support for Hezbollah. Work in cooperation with Hezbollah. Forget that. Iran must respect the sovereignty of Iraqi government and permit disarming, demobilization, and reintegration of Shia militias. Right? So no opposition to US domination of Iraq, right? Iran must also end its military support for the Houthi militia and work towards a peaceful political settlement in Yemen. Okay, let Saudi Arabia do this work there, right? Iran must withdraw all forces under Iranian command through the entirety of Syria. Withdraw from Syria, right? Iran must end support for Taliban and other terrorists in Afghanistan and the region. Iran must end the IRG Quds force support for terrorists and militant partners around the world. Right? And probably 12, and most importantly, Iran must end its threatening behavior against its neighbors, many of whom are US allies. This certainly includes threats against Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
What part of it is nuclear? None of it. Everything means Iran must submit to the United States demands and disarm itself, right? Now, you think this is just Trump administration and Republicans. But I'll call your attention to the previous deal made when Obama was president, Biden was vice president, Hillary Clinton was foreign minister. With regard to Syria, remember they had created a government outside as an alternative government, right?
Yeah.
And they had signed an agreement with that government when it takes power, it should do the following. This is the Doha Protocol. This future government, in replacement for Assad, should expel all members of the Workers' Party of Kurdistan, in Turkey, right? To cancel all agreements and contracts signed with Russia and China. To allow Qatari gas pipelines passage through the Syrian territory towards Turkey. To allow water pipes to pass through the Syrian territory from Ataturk Dam to Israel. Qatar and United Arab Emirates will rebuild Syrian damages as a result of war, but upon one condition, that all of the reconstruction agreements and deals and trades should be done by Qatari and United Arab Emirates companies and nobody else. The new government should terminate relations with Iran, Russia, and China. It must break off relations with Hezbollah and with Palestinian resistance movements. Well, this is the deal that Democrats wanted from Syria. Do you see any difference between that and what Republicans want from Iran? And do you expect that the new deal, if new nuclear deal, if Biden goes back to, will be asking less than what Trump was asking? I don't think so. Biden has already said that. Yes, they are willing to go back to nuclear deal, but the framework has to be expanded. They haven't said what, but I don't expect anything other than what Pompeo said. Expansion means all of those things. It means total disarmament of the Iranian government and its submission to the will of the United States. That is my view. With regard to Israel, well, let us not forget, as I said, those three-pronged policy of the Middle East, maintaining the hegemony of Israel, power, and especially nuclear, right, is part of this nuclear deal issue, right? It's being pushed by Israel. But at the same time, based on that globalization of imperialist strategy now with NATO, you see that Biden administration is following Trump's policy of reestablishing ties between Israel and Arab states. And they are moving forward to that, right? First, economic cooperations and maybe exchange of diplomats, right? Mm-hmm. But I am sure that very quickly they will turn into a military alliance against Iran. They are trying to create a military camp unified with Israel against Iran and Syria. And this is what is at work. Let me read you what recently, after Biden administration said that they will continue Trump's policy of strengthening Israel, right? Let me read a piece that Netanyahu said, which is a reflection of what this is going to go to. Hold on, may not find it. Okay. All right, here. This is Netanyahu after the State Department said they will continue Trump's policy with regard to Israel. This is in December. As long as Iran continues to threaten and dominate its neighbors, as long as Iran seeks to destroy Israel, as long as Iran continues to finance, arm, and train terrorist organizations around the region and the world, as long as Iran insists on pursuing nuclear weapons and their launch mechanisms, in other words, as long as Iran resists the US plans, nothing should be returned to normal with Iran. This is position of Israel, now emboldened by its new ties with the Arab countries now, and it's moving forward, and they are expanding that front right now. Mm-hmm. This is where we are.
Right. So we don't have too much time left, but I want to ask you about the foreign policy of the USA towards Latin America. Of course, there's the ever ongoing aggression against Cuba on the one hand, and Venezuela in recent years. So what can we expect there? One recent development was that the US declared that they're going to reduce some of the sanctions against Venezuela. What can that mean?
I don't expect that at all. As I explained to you, the general policy, that the fear that Venezuela is getting closer with China and Russia right now, and all that, is part and parcel of the same threat that is going to be intensified, not only against Venezuela, but against Cuba and against others. The question, they have already, they invited Guaido's representative to the inauguration of Biden, right?
Yes.
And Biden administration is still talking about transition talks in Venezuela. They do not recognize the legitimate government of Venezuela. Of course, the policy of Guaido type takeover is defeated. They have no internal political solution now. That tells me that they're going to move towards increased pressure from outside, economically and militarily. That is what is going on right now. And it's going to be the same with Cuba. With Cuba, the US plan originally during Obama was penetration, economic penetration, rather than kind of outright attack. So they were trying to use a different methods. They may try to go back, but the objective has not changed. And we know that with the fear of the United States, of the rise of China and global rivalry that is going to intensify, they want to make sure they have every corner covered right now. And most probably the pressure on all of the states that are resisting US domination, one way or another, is going to increase. We're going to be dealing with kind of semi-Cold War camp again.
Yeah.
Previous Cold War I type. The whole US is bringing the whole imperialist bloc together, and the force of circumstances is bringing the oppressed countries of the world and China and Russia together on the other hand. So we're going to have a kind of another round of confrontation of this sort. That's my feeling.